Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for joining us today at ICC UAE webinar on Incoterms 2020 organized by ICC UAE in partnership with Abu Dhabi Chamber of Commerce and Industry. My name is Habib Rizwan. I'm the General Coordinator of ICC UAE. The webinar will be for 1 hour. Those who would like to join the same session in Arabic, you will find the link in the chat box and you can join from there. Now I would like to invite Mr. Hilal Muhammad Al-Hamdi, the Deputy Director General of Abu Dhabi Chamber of Commerce, to give the welcome remarks. Over to you, Mr. Al-Hamdi.
Good morning. We Chamber of Commerce and Incoterms 2020. Through this seminar, we aim to provide current and aspiring trade professionals with the skills and expertise in the application of Incoterms 2020 rules in order to support secure international trade. Being the voice of private sector in Abu Dhabi, the Chamber is committed to supporting business and providing them with the service necessary to help them play their active role in the sustainable and comprehensive development process in the Emirates. Organizing this seminar is collaboration with the International Chamber of Commerce comes from our belief in the importance of Incoterms and their rules. Our seminar today will highlight the importance of Incoterms for international trade finance professionals, especially in the current COVID-19 turmoil. Today, events come to equip business with the latest rules in international trade with the ICC published to identify the responsibility of exports, imports, and as well as the risk and obligation of the sellers and buyer in different countries or verifying jurisdiction. In conclusion, I would like to welcome you again, wishing you all the success in your future endeavors. Thank you very much, sir. Back to you, Mr. Habib.
Thank you very much, Mr. Al-Hamdi. Thank you very much. Today, the webinar will be facilitated by Vincent O'Brien, who is the Director of ICC UAE. He has delivered training in more than 100 countries around the world. So now I'll hand over to Vincent O'Brien. Over to you, Mr. O'Brien.
Thank you very much, Habib and Mr. Wonderful welcome from Abu Dhabi Chamber of Commerce. The webinar because we're dealing with a very important set of rules that's so important in every country in the world. Rules that are single country in the world. If we look at the rules, is the of the book, you can see that there are no ICC rules for the use of domestic and international trade. I'm going to emphasize that they are still used predominantly for international trade between one country and another, between one jurisdiction and another. The rules, regulations, and laws may be different in the different jurisdictions. When we look at the rule book for the Incoterms, we'll see the history. And on the right-hand side of your screen, you actually see the old Incoterms 2010. So in the old book, actually, it articulated the obligations of the seller and the buyer. But with the passing of time and the development of new methods of transport, technology, etc., the rules had to be updated to make them more aligned with developments and trade and finance. So now here we are with the new book, the new rule book, and this is what I'll be taking you through during this webinar, highlighting the history, the changes, and the practical application of the new rules. When we look at Incoterms and we look at the background, we see these rules have real substance in practice and law because they are around for a long time. So actually in the history of the ICC and ICC publications, the Incoterms were first published in 1936. And then as time passed, with developments, particularly in transport, the rules were revised 7 times. 7 times, and of course I mentioned Incoterms 2010, basically 10 years ago. They were focusing on the new rule book, Incoterms 2020 International Chamber of Commerce. When I talk about the Incoterms rules, not a law, they're rules. So they are voluntary rules that are included in the contract of sale voluntarily by a seller and a buyer in the contract of sale. So basically, the purpose of the rules is not to cover everything in the contract, but cover some of the most important parameters in a contract between a seller and a buyer. So basically, when we boil it all down, we're talking about the obligations of the seller under the export contract of sale, and we're talking about the obligations of the buyer under that same export contract of sale. So on the right-hand side of your screen, you will see a page, and it focuses on the obligations of the seller and on the obligations of the buyer. Now, to be clear, within the Incoterms Rules 2020, there are 11 rules, and two of the most commonly used ones, and the changes from previous editions, Incoterms 2010, Incoterms 2020. But for each of the 11 rules, for each rule, there's an explanation in the book, and then it follows with the obligations of the seller and the obligations of the buyer. So no matter what rule the seller and the buyer agree in the contract of sale, whether it's FOB, CIF, DPU, or DDP, one of the 11, they have a quick reference to see the obligations of the seller and obligations of the buyer. When we look at the obligations, we see there are 10 obligations articulated for the seller. There are 10 obligations articulated for the buyer. And as we see at the top, second one down, A2 and B2, the really, really important one. When the seller in one country delivered the goods, A2, B2, when the seller has delivered, delivery, and B2, when the buyer has taken delivery. So for example, as it happens, right now I am in Ireland, okay? Ireland in the west of Europe, okay? And the weather is very dark and cold here. But say I was an exporter and you were the importer in Abu Dhabi. Under the Incoterms rules, the goods, the seller, I could actually deliver them at my factory here in Ireland, X Works, EXW, Dublin, Ireland. And of course, I could also deliver them to your place in Abu Dhabi, and that would be one of the D terms, deliver terms, which I will explain a little bit further. A1 to A10, B2 to B10, obligations like delivery, and of course the one that's really, really important as well is regarding the transfer of risk. So of course what this means is when the goods are being shipped from Dublin port, Dublin airport, to Abu Dhabi, to the port or to the airport, it is possible that the goods could get lost or damaged during transit, particularly during these challenging times. So under each Incoterm, it also articulates exactly when the risk in the goods getting lost, damaged or stolen transfers from seller to buyer. And a little tip for you is that where the delivery place takes place is also in each Incoterm the same place we have the transfer of risk. So delivery, taking delivery, transfer of risk from seller to buyer at the same place. Now, of course, for every Incoterm or every contract of sale, the seller has an obligation to provide you, the buyer, with an invoice, usually called a commercial invoice, but an invoice for the shipment or the sale of the goods. Moving on a little bit to the background of the Incoterms, and I'll just go through some of the key changes in recent times. We had Incoterms 2000, then we had Incoterms 2010, which I mentioned briefly, and of course, now this year, the beginning of the year, 1st of January, Incoterms 2020 became effective, basically became effective worldwide. Now, this is history, so you don't really need to remember it, but it's always good to understand something by appreciating where the background and the history has come from. In the Incoterms 2010, there were 4 Incoterms that were not being used extensively, and they are here in red. DAF, DES, DEQ, DDU. Delivered at frontier, DAF. DES, delivered ex-ship. DEQ, delivered X key, which will be the key at port of discharge or port of destination, and DDU, delivered unpaid, gone. But you don't need to really remember this. But more recently, Incoterms 2010, we had the introduction of two new Incoterms, and these were DAT and DAP. Now, this development was to follow changes in the supply chain that were evolving over time. Because over time, sellers wanted to take more control over the supply chain just to ensure they have a better service for their customers. So the D terms, delivered terms, started to be used more extensively. So DAT, delivered at terminal. Terminal, designated secure area for delivery of cargo, and DAP, delivered at place, were introduced. I'll explain in more detail later. DAP, delivered at place, DAT, delivered at terminal. But now we're getting up to date and to the subject matter of our actual workshop or our seminar. Incoterms 2020, well, what were the key changes? When we look at the key changes from 10 to 20, at first sight, they don't look that substantial, but actually they are quite substantial because they're making trade easier for seller and buyers. The rules are now clearer, more precise, and dare I say it, being an Irishman, the English being used in the new rule book is actually simpler, clearer, and easier to understand for someone like me. But the key changes are, in Incoterms 2010, the Incoterm DAT has been removed. Or really, more correctly, I should say, DAT, delivered at terminal, has evolved into the Incoterm DPU. So you need to remember one brand new Incoterm, DPU, which is replacing or evolving from DAT. DPU, delivered at place, unloaded. Just to get you thinking, imagine I'm in Ireland and I'm shipping goods by air to you, okay? By Etihad to Abu Dhabi, okay? But of course, at this point in time, you'd like me to take the risk of delivery of the goods to you as a buyer in Abu Dhabi. Maybe you should consider using DPU instead of, for example, the very commonly used term CIP. Now, that brings me to the next substantial change in Incoterms for 2010 to 2020. In Incoterms 2010, we have the Incoterms CI, cost insurance and freight, CIP, carriage paid, and we have the same two Incoterms. Incoterms 2020, we also have CIF and we also have CIP. Now, but here is where the key difference is in the new rules. The old rules, CIF and CIP, the insurance requirement was only on minimum terms. Okay? CIF used extensively for marine shipment, CIP multimodal, but also extensively for air shipments, such as O'Brien shipping from Ireland to Abu Dhabi. But here is the change. Under CIF in 2010, but also in Incoterms 2020, the minimum insurance is otherwise agreed in the contract. But under CIP, there is an elevated requirement for insurance. An elevated requirement for insurance, in simple terms, we could call this that the requirement would really be under CIP, air shipments, for example, that the insurance should be for all risk. So a slight change in the insurance requirements, CIP. But now we work into some more detail, and I hope you're finding it reasonably, at least reasonably interesting so far. Here the exporter in Ireland, okay? He's exporting all over the world. And, you know, he could be exporting to an importer in Abu Dhabi. So Incoterms are only 3 letters. There's 3 letters in each Incoterm. EXW, CIF, FOB, DPU, for example. But in 3 letters, it's like the ABC of international trade. With these 3 little letters, this can communicate a huge amount of information from the seller to the buyer. So by way of example, let's try it out. And as you can see, you have a chat facility. So I'm going to ask a question, and I just want you to answer, put in seller or buyer. I'll ask the question first. I'm the exporter in Ireland, and I'm selling, for example, to UAE. For example, the price on the commercial invoice is $3,250,000, and I must always issue an invoice, CIF Jebel Ali, port, Incoterms 2020. So can you type into the chat, who is responsible for the freight charges under CIF, seller or buyer? Now this is a very easy question to start. So could you type in seller or buyer? Okay, great. Seller. Well, that question is actually too easy for you. Actually, I see in the chat someone has asked me to explain DPU again. And I guarantee you that's the new Incoterm, so I will be explaining it in a lot of detail. But thank you for corresponding in the chat and keeping it going. Also under CIF, I stands for organize the insurance. Now a question for you. Under CIF, and you can type in again seller or buyer. Under seller or buyer, who will be responsible for any applicable import duties under CIF? Seller or buyer? Seller or buyer? Buyer. Oh, you got it. Buyer. Buyer. Okay. Thank you very much, Hassan. Thank you, Nasir. Thank you. Oh, buyer. I'll stop. I'll keep going. These are too easy. Okay. Let me continue now with a little bit more detail. And yes, I will come back. I will indeed come back to DPU a little bit later on. Here, for example, you have the importer in Abu Dhabi. One country, one country's regulations, one jurisdiction. The law will be the law of the UAE. For example, the exporter is in Ireland, different country, different regulations, different laws. This is where Incoterms really come into their own. They really facilitate international trade. So basically, when we look at the Incoterms rules, they were first published in 1936, and I highlight that they're international rules. And why is this important? Because if there's a dispute between the seller and the buyer, it may go to arbitration, it may end up in court, and then the judge maybe, or the lawyers are looking at the contract, and the question will be, well, what did these guys agree? What rules applied? And then the Incoterms rules will articulate the obligations of the seller and the buyer under the contract of sale. Someone asked the question, can we modify the rules? And of course, the answer is yes. They're voluntary rules. So if in your contract you say something that is different to a particular Incoterm, or you clarify obligations, well then of course you can modify, but you know it's recommended that very rarely modify the Incoterms rules because so much thought and consideration had gone into their development. Incoterms international rules. So the particular rules, again, we have 11 rules. And on the left, you see minimum obligation of a seller, EXW, X works. On the right-hand side, we have maximum obligation to D terms, DAP, DPU, DDP, okay, the seller. Depending on the requirements, it's easy. Well, it's pretty easy to select the appropriate Incoterm. Looking into more detail, well, go back in history, going back in history is very interesting. So much of trade was moved by marine on ships, with bulk of international trade. But it's quite amazing, and the UAE has contributed enormously to this. Now in value terms, nearly 30% of global trade moves by air, just under 30% in value terms. Of course, quantity much less, but in value terms, and of course the UAE with Abu Dhabi and Dubai being two of the major global trade air freight hubs in the world. Moving forward into some detail on the Incoterms rules. Everything involves risk, everything. So the idea is that manage risk and we distribute risk. So for example, I'm an exporter shipping from Dublin port or Hamburg port. Actually, this is a real case study. The goods were shipped on board the vessel at the port of loading. The goods are shipped on board and they're in a container. The exporter has in his hand the marine bill of lading. Bill of lading evidencing the goods shipped on board a named vessel at the port of discharge. Before the ship even sails away, there is an accident and the goods get damaged, as you can see in the picture. So I want to ask you another question, and if you don't mind typing in your answer, it will be great. And the answer is seller or buyer. Incoterm is FOB, free on board. The goods are on board, they were shipped on board, and after they're on board, an accident happens, the goods get damaged. O'Brien has the clean, shipped on board bills of lading in his hand. Under the Incoterms rules, whether it's to risk is this right now, seller or buyer? Now, you know, looking at it, you probably think it's the seller because it's still in his country, and maybe. So maybe you can type in the chat, and don't worry, I will not be picking out anyone with the wrong answer. Who's risk, seller or buyer? Buyer. Type in buyer. Buyer. You guys know you're. I can stop. Buyer. Once the goods cross the ship's rail at the port of loading under FOB, the risk transfers to the seller. But the key point is, even though these goods are still in the country of the exporter, at a port in the country of the exporter, the seller has delivered the goods once they are placed on board the vessel at the port of shipment in his country. So very, very good answers on the chat. You guys are doing great. Now let's get into a little bit more nitty gritty, a little bit more detail. When we look at the Incoterms rules, okay, here we have them on our left and right hand side of the screen. Okay, so there are 11 rules that increase cost and transfer, basically obligations from the seller to the buyer. So on one hand we have EXW, FCA, FAS, FOB, and there the delivery happens in the exporter's country. Then actually under the CIF, the goods are shipped to the named port of discharge, for example, CIF, but we need to slow down a little bit, and we need to, under these rules, even though the goods are physically loaded on board or delivered to the carrier at the country of export, or even if they are shipped and delivered to the buyer in the country of import, technically, legally, under the rules, the transfer of risk and of course delivery can happen at different points. Now I know this causes a little bit of confusion, but it's intentional because this is making you ask, do you exactly know when the seller has delivered the goods under each of the 11 Incoterms? Now, again, setting you up for a question later. In the COVID-19 situation, we've had many problems with something called force majeure. When this is an unexpected event beyond the control of the parties. So sometimes this meant goods could not be loaded on board. So goods are discharged in certain jurisdictions, but could not be cleared. They could not even be unloaded. And I will come to a case study on this a little bit later, but it's really, really important. When we look at a little bit more detail at the Incoterms, we see that we have Incoterms for different. Okay? And the ones you see on your screen now can be used for including marine shipment, multimodal, and a beautiful airplane in the middle of for air shipment, used extensively for air shipment. And then moving on, we have the Incoterms rules for sea and inland waterway transport. So just think about water, ocean, sea, ocean transport, marine transport, sea and inland waterway. FAS, free alongside ship. FOB, free on board. CIF, you're familiar with, and CFR. Only four. Now moving into some detail on the Incoterms rules. I'm the exporter, and I'm based. Someone else asked me to cover DPU again. It's coming, I promise. I'm the exporter in Ireland, and you asked me for a price. I give you a pro forma invoice, and if I sell the goods, then the commercial invoice. So EXW is the minimum obligation, you know, and under EXW, we look at the an ICC diagram. This is an older diagram, but I really think it explains it very well. We have the exporter on the left with the goods. We have the buyer on the right with the money, and we're trying to exchange the goods for the money. But in between, with local transporting country of export, we have the loading at the port of loading, or it could be at an airport, international carriage of the goods, and then we've unloading, and the little house with the red flag is import duty or customs, local transport, and the buyer with the money. In our diagram for each Incoterm, I have differentiated carriage between seller and buyer. The second element, where the goods are delivered between the seller and the buyer. And the third element I've included is the cost. What costs are shared or passed on between the seller and the buyer? And of course, we always have export clearance, export licensing on the export side, and import clearance, import duty, customs charges, etc. on the import side. So under X works, minimum obligation of the seller. I must just provide the goods at my premises. No carriage obligation. Even loading on the buyer's means of transport or conveyance is the buyer's risk. Delivery or risk? Well, it's at my premises. EXW, X works, seller's premises. Cost? Just the cost of the goods. There's no extra cost. Now, the important one for you to remember as a buyer, for example, is EXW does not even include export clearance, export licensing, export formalities. So while it is a very convenient Incoterm for me, I have very little obligation. For a buyer, it causes buyers lots of headaches and lots of problems. Now, that doesn't mean it can't be done, but I'm just urging you, be careful if you're an importer, importing under X works. Moving on a little bit, then we move from the E terms to the next term, which begins with the letter F. FCA, but I'll also be talking briefly about FAS and so the letter F, so important in these Incoterms. The letter F, FCA, FAS, FOB, it stands for the word free. But under Incoterms FCA, the seller must deliver the goods free of additional costs to the buyer at a certain name. We all know that there's nothing better to explain something than an example. In Ireland, you're in Abu Dhabi. You want to buy a high-tech machine from me in Ireland. I give you the perform invoice, I give you the invoice, okay? And on my invoice, I have FCA Dublin Airport, Incoterms 2020. That's the Incoterm. So what does this mean? In simple terms, if it's FCA in all the F terms, all the every F term under the rule, the seller must get the goods so the seller is responsible for all the F terms but for export formalities. Under FCA, with the goods going by air, I must deliver the goods to the airport, basically, Dublin Airport. I must get a customary transport document, which was going by air. Obviously, it will be an airway bill, okay? And the goods are delivered when they are handed into the custody of the carrier's agent, otherwise known as the first carrier. The risk also transfers in the goods from seller to buyer, not at the seller's premises, not at export clearance, but when they are delivered into the custody of the carrier's agent, or the first carrier. And of course, I must as seller pay the cost to get the goods to the airport of departure. But of course, under FCA, the seller will be responsible for the freight charges. So if I looked at that airway bill, if you work in a bank and document your credits, your expectation would be that that airway bill will be marked freight paid. So FCA, name, place of destination, airport in my example, airport in the country of departure. FAS is a term that, you know, when I'm doing seminars, people say, oh, we don't use FAS, but it's interesting. Different countries, Ireland, we're surrounded by a little island. we've lots of ports. And in Ireland, we have lots of rain and we've lots of... So we export a lot of beef. So very often, large beef exporters will be selling to a buyer who will vessel for bringing the beef, frozen beef, for example, import. In this scenario, in this commodity trade, under FAS, the seller must deliver the goods alongside ship, basically on the at the port after export clearance. After export clearance, the risk transfers from seller to buyer at the same point, and of course, all costs after that are for the buyer. Now, this is important because if it was small electronics being shipped by air, nobody cares about the loading charges because they're absorbed in the freight charge and they're so small anyway. But if, for example, it was a shipment, a chartered shipment of beef, and now the seller delivers on the quay alongside ship, well, the loading charges will be substantial. And of course, the loading charges in this case will be for the account of the buyer because the seller, yes, is not responsible for loading. Bringing us to an Incoterm you are all very, very familiar with, and I'm watching my time, and we're exactly on time. One you're very familiar with, but it's no harm to say it's the mother of education. FOB, very important. FOB, named port of shipment. If I'm the seller and I give you a price, a quotation, FOB, I must issue a commercial invoice. The seller prepares the goods for export. He delivers the goods as a seller when the goods are shipped on board the vessel at the port of shipment. In an earlier version of Incoterms, and delivery occurs when the goods cross the ship's rail at the port of shipment. Now that is not in new Incoterms, it's when they're placed on board, but the imagery of the goods crossing the ship's rail always stood with me as a very clear explanation when the risk has transferred from seller to buyer, but no doubt the new wording is an improvement from a technical and a legal point of view. So regarding carriage of goods, seller must carry the goods to the port of shipment. The goods must be loaded on board the vessel. The shipped on board bill of lading will be issued. The bill of lading will evidence freight paid, freight collect, freight paid, freight collect. Someone has actually typed in the chat, you're ahead of me, freight collect, which is absolutely wonderful. Okay, so seller not responsible for carriage of the goods. The buyer is responsible for the carriage. The risk transfers to the seller when the goods are shipped on board. All costs, including freight charges and any import duties, if applicable, will be for the account of the buyer. Okay, right. Okay, I have a question asking me the difference between FCA and F. And my good friend Habib is reminding me I haven't answered it, but okay. Under FOB, the transfers when they are shipped on board at port of shipment. Now the question is, what is the difference with FCA? And can FCA use marine shipment? Well, let me answer your questions in reverse. One, the easy one, FCA can be used for marine shipment. It's used for any mode of shipment. But I think your key question is regarding delivery and transfer of risk. FOB, this happens when the goods are forward at the port of shipment. FCA, risk transfers from seller to buyer at an earlier point before the goods are actually shipped on board. And this is the risk transfers under FCA when the goods are handed into the custody of the carrier, first carrier, at, in this case, it's a marine shipment, at the port or place of shipment. So I hope that actually helped. FOB. Moving on now, we have covered the F terms and we are looking at the C terms. And again, keeping it as clear as I can. Under the C terms, now the seller will be responsible for organizing and paying for the carriage or the freight to a named place or port of destination, usually but not always in the importer's country. So CFR, marine term. Now when we look at our diagram, we see that the carriage responsibility of the seller is to the port of destination. But interestingly, under CFR, regarding the delivery and transfer of, you need to remember this, delivery and transfer occurs when the goods are placed on board the vessel at the port of shipment. So even though the carriage and the freight is organized and paid to the port of destination or discharge, the delivery and transfer of risk is aligned with FOB when the goods are placed on board the vessel at the port of shipment. So that's really, really interesting. And of course, the cost, of course, the seller must pay the cost of the freight to the port of destination. But of course, CFR means that the import duties, if any, if applicable, will be for the account of the buyer. Are doing absolutely great. And okay, I have a question, but it's going to come up. Ask me about CIF, but believe me, it's actually the next Incoterm that we're going to actually use. CIF in marine shipments. Carriage of the goods to the port of destination. The same. But with CIF, the I stands for insurance. So the seller is responsible for organizing and paying the insurance premium for insurance. But remember, under CIF, it's under minimum terms. So when we look at the insurance of the goods, we will see that the value of the insurance under the rules must be a minimum of 100% of the CIF value or the invoice value of the goods. So while it may be an oversimplification, it helps us to understand. Even though the seller is organizing the insurance and paying the insurance premium, it's really on behalf of the buyer. So if, for example, the goods get damaged, lost, or stolen, well, it would really be for the buyer to make a claim under the insurance. So of course, it's very important to be sure that the risks covered are the appropriate risks for the transaction between the seller and the buyer. Oh, so now I have a case study on CIF, and it's a real one because it's related to an email I got about CIF and force majeure. So I'm going to slow down a little bit because this is a very interesting story. I got an email from someone called Ashi, a lady called Ashi, and it was regarding a query, CIF, name destination, force majeure. So a real query. And I'll make it a little bit shorter, okay? The COVID-19 is, I'll actually zoom in so you can read it a little bit more carefully. Okay. The COVID-19 problematic for us. Well, it's, as we know, it's problematic for everyone, and it's a terrible situation, but we must proceed. So problematic. So this is an exporter. We shipped on the basis of CIF. CIF, Incoterms 2020. So we call the port of discharge or destination, port B. Now, she named the port in her email, but I just don't want to mention it, you know. Port B, Incoterms 2020, CIF. The goods were loaded on board the vessel, so we'll give the vessel the name Vin, because that's my name, so I can't get in trouble for calling the vessel Vin, okay? At the port of Port A, which is the port of shipment or the port of loading, for shipment destination, Port B. Very normal, very simple, nothing exciting yet. The problem, what is the problem? The problem is that due to lockout, maybe that should be lockdown, but anyway, if due to lockout, well, lockout is a term often used with ports, the port is locked and people cannot get in or out, or goods cannot get in or out. The problem is that due to lockout at port of destination, the goods could not be unloaded. Sounds troublesome. And the buyer is suffering acute delay in delivery of the goods. Wow, he can't get his hands on the goods, so I'm sure he's problems with his customers in the country of import. delay in delivery of goods plus demurrage. Wow, not looking good. A problem. The buyer is holding back payment. Well, I guess many buyers would feel like holding back payment. I have not got my goods, okay? So I'm not paying, okay? The buyer is holding back. I'm not saying that's the correct approach, but it happens. The buyer is holding back payment due to force majeure, lockdown, lockout, at the port of discharge, which he says is unexpected and beyond his control, as it is state-driven lockdown for health purposes. Well, it sounds like a force majeure to me. But that's not the question. The question is, what can I do? Because this lady has a problem. Goods were shipped. They went on the ship. There's a discharge, but no money because the buyer cannot take delivery of the goods. What can I do as if the goods not delivered, we will be losing our payment rights? Okay. Someone asked me another question about force majeure, but I'll come back to it. I promise. Okay. Well, here is the answer. Okay. Here is the answer, and the answer is the answer we've already given. The buyer is holding back payment due to shore at the port of discharge, which he says is unexpected beyond his control. Okay? And the buyer is suffering acute delay in delivery of the goods. What can I do as if goods not delivered, we will lose payment rights? And you know, that is true. That is actually true. Under the contract, if the goods are not delivered as contractually agreed, the seller is going to have a payment problem under the contract. But the good news for you, Ashi, and the reason Incoterms are so useful, they are precise. So under CIF, we already saw delivery occurs. The goods are actually contractually delivered when they are placed on board the vessel at the port of shipment. You have already delivered the goods when they were shipped on board. The fact that there is a problem at the port of discharge does not impact on your delivery obligation. You have already delivered, so you are compliant. Now, of course, that doesn't mean you're getting your money automatically, because people don't like paying if they don't get goods. If this goes into arbitration or goes into a legal situation, you are in a very, very, based on the application of ICC rules. Goods are delivered when they are placed on board the port of shipment. Again, we're doing good on time, and well, we're doing pretty good. Remember, I mentioned CIP example, and I used it when I was talking about air shipment from Dublin to Abu Dhabi. Under CIP, organizes the carriage to the place or point of destination, international airport. But remember, when the goods are handed in the first carrier, the carrier's agent at the airport of the target. And as explained, this applies regardless of transport, but the air shipment one is a very good one to actually explain it. So now, my dear friends at Abu Dhabi Chamber of Commerce, all your participants, we're getting very near to the and the three people have asked me to talk about again, and that is regarding DPU. But before I get to DPU, I want to AP. But I want to make it very clear the difference between DAP and DPU. Now, let's give you a case. You're an importer in Abu Dhabi, and you're importing from this guy in Ireland for many years. Business related. In recent times, you know, goods got damaged on Dhabi, or for example, there was a delay in the goods arriving in Abu Dhabi. So we love your product, but we want to change the Incoterm. And I say, why? Using CIP for years on air shipments, it's perfect. And he said, yeah, it works. You know, in line with international developments in carriage, we would like you as seller to take more control of the supply chain. And I go, yeah, that's no problem. That sounds pretty good to us. So we would like to move from CIP to DAP. That to me, so now I explain it to you. Under DAP, the seller is responsible for the carriage of goods to the named place or point of destination, for example, Abu Dhabi International Airport. Under DAP, however, the seller is responsible for delivering of the goods at Abu Dhabi International Airport. So the seller is taking on the delivery and risk until the goods are delivered to Abu Dhabi International Airport. My responsibility, my obligation. Whereas CAP, it will be at the airport of departure, the first carrier. Seller now, like CIP, must pay the cost to the named place of destination, I hope I said destination, Abu Dhabi International Airport. Now, under DAP, it can be used for air shipments, as articulated, but also for marine shipments. And of course, under DAP, under the rule, unloading charges, if applicable, the buyer. And of course, under import duties, taxes, etc., to that point are also for the account. So it does not include unloading in the context of the seller selling under Abu Dhabi International Airport. Which brings us to the brand new Incoterm. Now, just so boss or to your colleagues and you know what happened at the Incoterms, I want you to type 3 letters. Wonderful in the chat. I want you to type 3 letters. So I asked the question. Here is the question. The Incoterm DPU has replaced, or should, and it's no longer in the Incoterms rulebook. Has replaced what? In 3 letters. I just want to check if you are paying attention. What has DPU replaced? Wonderful, Delano. Andy, Hassan, yes. Fatima. Well, everyone appears to know the answer. Absolutely. Yeah. Yes. Exactly. DAT. So DPU basically has evolved from DAT. So you might ask why? DAT was delivered at terminal. So for example, in the old Incoterms, it could be O'Brien is delivering to the International Air Freight Cargo Terminal at Abu Dhabi. DAT, Abu Dhabi International Airport. Now, in the revision of Incoterms rules, it was felt that using the word terminal, even though the concept was excellent, it was too narrow. It was decided that the idea of carriage, delivery, and loading at the named place of destination should be made broader in scope. So that's how DAT was replaced, or more correctly, evolved into DPU. So precisely, DPU, Abu Dhabi International Airport, O'Brien will deliver the goods by air, carriage of the goods to airport of destination at Abu Dhabi International Airport. The risk in the delivery of the goods would stay with O'Brien until the goods are delivered to Abu Dhabi International Airport. O'Brien must pay the costs, which include the loading air freight to Abu Dhabi International Airport. But you know, this sounds very like DAP. DPU sounds very like DAP. But there is a key difference, and you guys are so good. Someone has already typed in the answer in the chat before I tell you. Actually, DPU also includes the unloading of the goods at the place or point or port of departure. So basically, we need to remember that between DAP and DPU, under loading at the port of destination. And this, my friend, very, very last Incoterm. Delivered duty paid, no substantial change here. The wording has changed. The priorities, as I mentioned at the beginning, have been raised for delivery and transfer of risk. But DDP is maximum obligation of the seller to the buyer. Under DDP, the seller must deliver the goods duty paid if duty is applicable in the jurisdiction of the importer, delivery duty paid, and the customary transport document, but it needs to be articulated in the contract, is that the seller will expect the buyer to sign something that is called a POD. Customer, it doesn't have to be this document, but it's the most common one, a POD, which is a proof of delivery document, maximum obligation of the seller and the buyer. So I'm seeing we have a great number of participants still here. And if you have any question, please put it in the chat. I have one question that I haven't answered yet, but I'm going to answer it at the end. It's kind of a lead question, so I will. But now, my dear friends, I am going to move on and talk about, I'm going to give you some questions because I'm going to test if you have been listening. Well, have you absorbed what I have actually presented? Now, as we know, a word about the ICC, it's the World Business Organization. And we do many things in the world of business, but the most important one for me, now people have different priorities, but the most important one for me, and I think it's important to you, is that we write the rules for global business. Now, when I say global business, I mean trade in particular. Incoterms we're talking about used in every country in the world. UCP for documentary credits used by banks in every country of the world. Even where there is no law for documentary credits articulated in a jurisdiction, UCP is applied. We also have rules for guarantees. We've rules for standby letters of credit, but the rules are members, the practitioners. So if you want to join us, we're delighted to have you joining us as probably the professional members of the International Chamber of Commerce. But now, and I want to finish on time or even a little bit ahead. So I'm going to take you through the Incoterms 2020. And if you can answer questions, pretty much have picked up everything I've covered today. And if you can't answer the questions, well, I probably didn't do a good job. Okay. So let's try with our. Okay. Now, here we go. The Incoterms 2020 rules quiz. First question, my dear friends. Okay. And if you don't mind, I'd like you. The answers are all very short. You type buyer, seller, true, false, paid, collect, something like this, one word. So I'm going to ask you to help me out if you don't mind. So you'll find the chat, I'll ask the question, type in your answer, and let's see how we get on. Okay, here we go. Okay. Well, that was too easy, okay? Let's see. Let's try anyway. This will be like a test of the system. In all of the Incoterms 2020 rules, the seller has an obligation to provide the buyer with a commercial invoice. True or false? Well, this one is too easy, but let's just see how the chat actually works, okay? The chat works, okay, right. True. A little bit too easy. Keep going because I'm reading some questions, okay? Oh, wow. Okay. I have a good question on DPU. Yeah. Great. True. Everyone true, but this was a little bit too easy, and the answer is true. Okay, my dear friends. Let's move on to our second question, and I'm careful with the button this time. Okay. Now, this is a tricky one. Under EXW, under the rules now, I want you to answer by the rules. Under EXW, the places the goods, the disposal of buyer at the seller's premises, loaded on the buyer's collecting vehicle. So this statement is saying that the seller is responsible for the loading. True or false? You're doing good. False. False. Mansour, false. Nasser, false. Fatima, false. Diju, false. False. You are absolutely super. I tried to confuse you, but you're not easy to confuse. Okay, let's keep going because our time is good. And Habib, I see, is appearing there.
Yes.
But let me ask this question before Habib asks me any other question. Let me go through this, and you can ask me some other question you're getting on the side. Friends,
Sure.
The seller fulfills its obligations to deliver when it hands over the goods to the carrier in the manner specified in the chosen rule, and not when the goods reach the named port of destination. Now, it's a very interesting question, because CIF, we think automatically of the port of destination. CIP, airport of destination, we think of destination. But the question is, where does the delivery happen? Okay? So, when CIP, CFR, or CIF use, the seller fulfills its obligation to deliver when it hands the goods over to the carrier. Specified in the rule to reach the named port or place of destination. True or false? Oh gosh, you guys are so fast. True, 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 true. Wow, you are amazing. And hopefully it is true. Congratulations. Wonderful. I was beginning to get confused at talking so much. This question, Habib, and then I'll come back to you, and I have a few short-term questions. But let's get this one done because it's linked to the last one. Ready? Under the Incoterms 2020 rules, must the seller deliver under which of the Incoterms, which? So you have to pick one. The 11 are across the screen. You've got to type in whichever is the correct one. It's only 3 seconds. But here's the question. Under which of the Incoterms 2020 rules must the seller deliver the goods on a quay or a barge at the port of shipment nominated buyer? The risk of loss or damage to the goods passes when the goods are delivered on the quay or barge and the buyer bears all costs from that moment onwards. So can you please pick which of the Incoterms rules is the correct one? And I think, Habib, we can give them maybe 10 seconds for this. Do you think that will be fair? Yes, the answers are coming in. Answers are coming in. Coming in. Yes, 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 and yes, and you are all correct. Wonderful, 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 wonderful. FAS, delivery on the quay at the port of shipment. That means the seller delivers the goods free alongside ship. Now, one person that got said FOB, and it's very close to FOB, but delivery under FOB is when the goods are placed on board the vessel, whereas under FAS, when it's delivered on the quay just before. And Habib, I think you have another question for me there that you have received.
Yes, somebody was asking a question that if documents are presented to the bank under LC, and the document does comply, but the goods does not arrive due to COVID, will the bank still pay? What would be the case in that?
Now, Habib, that's kind of a trick question, because I'm talking about Incoterms, but you're asking me a question about documentary credits, okay?
So I'm not asking, it is asked by one of the participants.
Well, then I think I better answer it. Here is the answer. And if you have a problem with this, let me just tell you, ICC UAE will help you sort out this problem. But to answer the question, the documents have been presented to the bank. whatever the Incoterms.
Yes.
The bank checks the documents comply, or the bank don't refuse them. But now what has happened is it's something a little bit like Ashley's story. The goods transit by and they come to the port of discharge, but they cannot be delivered. So the documents comply, but the goods can't get there. Must the bank pay? The answer is yes. Under ICC rules, this is very, very clear. Once the documents comply, the bank must pay. And Habib, if that participant has a problem, they should contact us after this webinar, because this is somewhere we can actually help them.
Yeah.
Okay. Anything else? Because I haven't here, because I've one or two questions coming in on the chat that I want to get to, but I'm in no hurry. If you have a question that I've missed, please ask me.
Somebody was asking about digitalization, but it is, I think, completely separate subject, so it can be covered in any other webinar. So.
Yeah, we could talk about digitalization, I think, later. But let me just tell you that if you are actually dealing with a bank, let's for example, in my air shipment example that I gave earlier, it is possible to set up letters of credit that the airway bills, for example, can be presented digitally. But that is kind of another subject. So if you don't mind, I'll go into this first. So thank you very much. I have a question here on the chat. Before I go back to my question, I have a question, and someone asked me regarding DPU. Remember the new Incoterm? DPU, delivered, placed, unloaded. When I say DPU, I keep nearly saying delivered, placed, unpaid, but that's not correct. It's DPU, delivered, placed, unloaded. So here is the question. Under DPU, okay, who is responsible for import clearance, import duties, and taxes? Well, the answer to that question is, under the rule, the responsibility for import clearance, taxes, etc., is an obligation of the buyer. So obligation of the buyer is the precise, clear answer. Always say unless otherwise specified in the contract. But say not specified in the buyer, the answer in the contract, the buyer is responsible. So Habib, I'll go back to the quiz. But if another question comes in, please pop in again and ask me, because we want to answer every question. And our time is still pretty good. Okay. Okay, my dear friends, I go back to our quiz and we see how we get on. Oh my gosh. Okay. Well, under CIF Incoterms, the buyer must clear the goods for import. True or false? Well, I think we all saw that that is true. But that helps us speed up a little bit. Now, next question, which is a very important one. And we slow it down. FCA. So I am the exporter, FCA, free carrier. Under the term FCA, when the goods are picked up at the seller's premises, it is clarified in the Incoterms rules that the goods must be loaded by. Now, you know what? I didn't actually explain this. So that's bad that I forgot to explain it, but it's good because now with the answer, you'll never forget it. Okay? So just have a guess. Remember, FCA is when the seller delivers the goods, and because it's an F term, it's always after export clearance. So under FCA, the seller is always responsible for export clearance. But in our case study here, the buyer has provided his means of conveyance. So what do you think? Free carrier, the goods must be loaded by the buyer, the carrier, or the seller. And as you know, these are rules just for the seller and the buyer. The Incoterm rules are for the seller and the buyer, but they're not actually for the other parties involved. And we have coming in Nasser. Yeah, Asama. Yeah, everyone knows the answer. You guys, I didn't even tell you, but you know under FCA, when the seller is providing his means, actually responsible for the loading of the goods on the buyer's means of conveyance. Absolutely. Next question. And we're nearly there. We're nearly there. A bill of lading has been issued by the carrier in respect of a contract of sale between the seller and the buyer, which was agreed on a CIF basis. So CIF, cost, insurance, and freight. I actually have it. This is a little bit like the documentary credit question. But imagine you are looking at the bill of lading, my dear participants. On reviewing the bill of lading, and the Incoterm is CIF, and it's CIF, for example, on the opening commercial invoice. Because the Incoterm is CIF, my question for you is, on reviewing the bill of lading, you would expect the bill of lading to be marked. When you're looking at it, you expect it to be marked. You expect it to be marked freight collect, freight paid, or freight not applicable. So pick one, freight collect, freight paid, or freight not applicable. Freight paid, we have one collect, paid, freight paid, 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 freight paid, freight paid, freight paid, and sewer paid, Nasser also freight paid. And the answer, my dear friends, because of CIF, our expectation will be that the bill of lading will be marked freight paid. Oh, someone said prepaid, but that's the correct answer as well, because very often the bill of lading will be marked freight prepaid, but freight paid, freight prepaid, answer for CIF. Moving on. Under the terms starting with the letter C and D. So what does this mean? Well, it could be CFR, CIF, CPT, 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 or CIP, or D, DAP, DAT, or for example, DDP. So here's the question. Under an Incoterm starting with the letter C or D, it is for the buyer to make the contract of carriage. Carriage, basically transport of the goods. True or false? Oh, you're answering ahead of me. False, false, false. Delano again, Mansur. False, false, false. You guys are, everyone is saying false. Yama, yes. And the answer, of course, is false. Because C or D, it's the seller always responsible for the contract of carriage. I must say, this has been a really great seminar with such good participants who already know the rules. I hope I'm helping a little bit. Next question. Under the term FOB of the Incoterms Rules, oh, this is a very tricky question. And again, I didn't cover it, but it means you would remember the answer. Under the term FOB, and you all know what FOB means. FOB, free on board. FOB, what could be better than FOB? Okay, FOB term. Under the term FOB of the Incoterms Rules, ownership or property rights in the goods transfers from seller to buyer when the goods are placed on board the vessel at the port of shipment. And I know I'm smiling and joking a little, but the answer to this question is really, really important. Now, the question is not about delivery or risk. It's asking us ownership of the goods, ownership or property rights of the goods. So, under the term FOB of the Incoterms Rules, ownership or property rights of the goods transfers from seller to buyer when the goods are placed on board the vessel at the port of shipment. And this is kind of a trick question. So just don't worry, wrong answer, it doesn't matter, but we will have a go at typing in the answer. So just pick true or false. False, false, true, true, false, false, true. Wow. False, false, true, false. So this is the first question where we kind of have a mixture of answers, okay? So let me give you the answer. But as I told you, this question is a little bit misleading, but it's intentionally because when you hear the answer, you will never. So the answer is this. Incoterms rules do not deal with ownership or transfer of property rights at all. So we're thinking about delivery and risk. Regarding ownership, Incoterms rules do not specify. We kind of automatically in our mind consider that ownership transfers at a transfer of risk, but the rules themselves. So this is something you need to separately deal with in the contract of sale. And very often these days we see it a clause in the contract of sale, which is known as a retention of title clause. Now, I don't want to go into detail because we haven't time, but the retention of title clause most often states that the seller retains title or ownership of the goods until the goods are actually paid for. So as most of you got the answer correct, not everybody, the answer is actually false. So actually very, very good. One or two more questions. Now, this one is an interesting one. And our time is actually still very, very good. And we've answered so many questions. And I'm looking at the chat here. Any more questions coming in? Yeah, okay. DAT, okay, I'll come back to it. Okay, and through, okay. Here's the question. So I want you to look at the screen. So we're talking about the Incoterm CIF, which is a marine term. And on the screen, you have 1, 2, 3. And these are basically 3 points of delivery. So here is the question. And your answer is now going to be 1 or 2 or 3. At which point 1 or 2 or 3, 1, 2, shipped on board, and 3, port of dispatch. So at which point does risk transfer from the seller to the buyer under CIF named port of destination? Remember, FOB and CIF, the delivery of the goods aligned at the same place, So 1, 2, or 3. 2, 2, with a 3, with 3, and 2, and 2, and 3, and 2, 2, with a 1. But by far, most of you are number 2. So let me again emphasize that under CIF, the seller organizes and pays the freight to the named destination port of destination. But under CIF, and this is really important, like FOB, the risk transfers when the goods are placed on board the ship, the vessel at the port of shipment. Oh, answers still coming in. Oh, more answers coming in. So 2, 2, 2, 2. So again, most of you got it correct. The risk transfer on board number 2 at the port of shipment. Excellent. Okay. Now, I'm nearly there and I'm watching our time and we will be on time. It is possible to use both EXW seller's premises and FCA seller's premises. Now, when we think of seller's premises, we automatically think of EXW. Okay? Think about it. But it's also possible to use seller's premises, maybe because the buyer or seller to organize and be responsible for export clearance. Because remember, if the term is an F term, FCA, the seller is always responsible for export clearance. So the tricky question is, which of the following outlines the primary differences between these terms? Well, we have 3, 1 on the top, 1 in the middle, 1 on the bottom. So we'll call them, I really should have called them 1, 2, 3. So I want you to type in your answer 1, 2, or 3, 3 being the bottom one, 1 being the top one. Which of the following outlines the primary difference between Ex-Works and FCA? FCA includes loading by the seller, but not export clearance. F term, okay. FCA includes export clearance, but not loading. FCA includes loading by the seller and also export clearance. And type in 1, 2, or 3. 3, 3, 3. Third, but that's okay. 3, 3, 3, and you are absolutely correct. FCA includes loading, but it's an F from Delano. Nasser 3, it also includes export clearance. You guys are absolutely wonderful. We're very nearly there. This is my last question, okay? And so it's kind of a trick question. Which is the best? Which is the best? You have to make a choice, one or the other, FOB or VOB. So you need to type FOB or VOB into your answer on the checkbox. Okay, FOB, VOB, FOB,
VOB, absolutely.
VOB. Well, I hope it's VOB because FOB is free on board, and of course VOB is me, Vincent O'Brien. And of course, this reminds you of my email, vob@iccuae.com. VOB. So again, our question on documentary credits. Please follow up with me, my friend, because we can help you with this. And the other questions on Incoterms, feel free to actually communicate it with us because we will be delighted actually to help you with all of these requirements. So Habib, if I've missed the question, I'll hand back over to you.
Thank you very much, Vincent, for such an informative presentation. I hope everybody would have enjoyed this one. Thank you very much to Abu Dhabi Chamber of Commerce, especially Mr. Hilal Al-Hamli, Hamda Al-Suwaidi and her team for organizing this wonderful webinar. Thanks to everybody for joining us today, especially to the participant, to everybody for joining us. Thank you very much. Thanks to everybody.
Thank you, everybody. You're very welcome. We look forward to you joining us in further events with Abu Dhabi Chamber of Commerce. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, we will share the presentation, and thank you. Bye-bye.